We did a recent straw poll in which we asked people what's the best rig for blue water cruising. The ketch came a very lowly third.
In a cruising world dominated by catamarans and light wind boats, the ketch is almost antiquated by today's YouTube standards.
But if you really are serious about offshore sailing, going across oceans, the ketch has proven itself time and time again, even by today's standards.
If you're looking at buying a boat to sail around the world, then you really should consider a ketch. In this video, we're going to be putting forward some reasons as to why it's still one of the best blue water sailing plans, due in part to its balance, performance and comfort.
But before we try to convince you to buy a ketch, here's Jamie playing with his bumpers and Millie feeling a bit lazy.
Where are we going to go? Where would you like to go? Right, should we talk about bumpers? Today we're going to be putting some bumpers on the back of Esper. Now, Mark and Kim from ZZ very kindly allowed me one bumper to measure up, and I decided that it would work, but I could do it two. So on the day before they left, or on the morning that they left the marina, they came over and they gift wrapped a second bumper for my birthday, which was very kind of them. What am I talking about? I'm talking about these things. This is a bumper. So they inherited these things when they bought their boat 5-6 years ago, and we think they're from a marina because they're marine grade anti-UV foam, and they have two of these installed on the back of their boat so that when they hoist their dinghy it rests against these bumpers. Now we've got a similar setup. The only problem is that we rest ours against fenders, and they tend to move when we're at sea and the fenders sort of get dislodged. So the plan is to mount two large pieces of chopping board and then to bolt these onto the chopping board. You can't stick them onto it, nothing sticks to this foam. Mark and Kim have tried this, they've tried gluing it on and it didn't stay, so we have to bolt them through. So we managed to find a piece of chopping board thanks to Alvin, who's based around the marina and deals with lots of boats here, so thank you Alvin for the chopping board. We're going to cut it up, and I managed to source some stainless bolts, only 304, that's all we could get, but it's better than nothing. And we're going to attempt to mount these things on the back of Esper. Okay, so here we have our two vertical struts cut out of chopping board, and the next thing I want to do now is to put the U-bolts in. So I've just measured them up and drilled a couple of holes for each U-bolt, like so. My only concern is that the support only goes up to about here, so there's quite a bit of overhang at the top that has no support. There's not much I can do about that unless I were to extend the push bit verticals, so we're just going to have to make do with that. So if you remember, I said earlier this will not stick to the chopping board, so we have to bolt them through. Now I've got hold of some 4-inch in length bolts. As it currently stands, they will only just fit like so. Obviously we want them to protrude out the back to screw them on. But more importantly, of course, this has to be countersunk. We don't want the head of this bolt sticking out from here. So we actually need to countersink it down inside the foam so that the bolt protrudes out the other end by a good centimetre or so. So the question is, how do we countersink these and make them look neat? So there we go, one plug made. Actually used the washer, which I'm going to be using on these bolts to draw around it. Now it's a little bit rough inside, but by the time that big bolt with its round head is pulled through there, that should be nice and neat and clean. There we go, I think that's worked pretty well. Nicely countersunk, so there's no chance of the dinghy catching on that. Well, there she is, that's the first one on. That's the easy one because I haven't got to cut any metal I have on the port side. Now as you can see, There's a little bit of flex there. I say a little, there's quite a bit because there is no support at the top half here. I think time will tell whether that's a good thing or a bad thing actually. It might be quite nice to have a bit of flex, but anyway, we'll see how we get on with that. So just to recap, that chopping board is U-bolted from the inside, and the nuts are in between the chopping board and the foams. You can't see those. And then we've got 3 4-inch bolts going through the foam, countersunk at that end, and then on this end you can see we've got 1 nut on there. There is no room to put the nuts on the other ones, but the bolts actually screwed through the chopping board anyway, so they're held in place. Let's see how we get on with this. The reason why we've put this episode together is because we get asked quite frequently about ketch rigs and what we think of it. And most recently, Doug Trucking on YouTube asked, do you guys have a video of why you bought a ketch sailboat and not just one main mast?
He wasn't the only one. David Crumray on YouTube also had a question. Greetings from the Great Smoky Mountains. I would really enjoy a discussion on your ketch rig, why you love the ketch rig, when the ketch rig is preferable in sailing, in what conditions, etc, etc.
So especially for you, Doug and David, and for anyone else out there who's interested in the ketch rig, we're going for it now.
Jamie's going to start us off on a ketch rig 101.
Okay, a ketch has 2 masts. It has a main mast, just like a sloop, and it has a second mast called a mizzen. And for it to be a ketch, that mizzen mast has to be forward of the rudder post. If it's behind the rudder post, it's called a yawl.
The sails used on a ketch are the head sail, the mainsail and the mizzen sail, so one more than a sloop. But of course any number of additional sails may be used. Esper, for example, has a staysail, which makes her a cutter-rigged ketch. Light wind sails may also be used, and we'll talk a bit more about the Mizzen Staysail in a minute.
Let's look at the sails of a ketch. Starting at the head, ketches are most likely to have a Yankee. This is a high-cut head sail and is normally around about 100% in that the clew only comes back to the mast. The 2 main advantages of this is that it may be used in heavier weather without reefing, thus keeping the sail shape, and the high foot allows the seas to break without it dragging through the water in heavy seas.
If the ketch is rigged with a staysail, and many of them are, this is mounted on the inner forestay and creates a slot between the headsail and the mainsail to provide extra lift. This is known as a cutter rig, and both ketches and sloops can be cutter rigged.
Onto the mainsail. The main mast will be shorter than a traditional sloop, but it's normally stepped in the same location as a sloop, which is why boat manufacturers can offer both sail plans from the same mould.
The mizzen is the sail that makes the difference. This is a much smaller version of the main mast and provides a whole host of advantages, which we'll get to in a moment.
And Liz mentioned the Mizzen Staysail, one of our favourite sails. This is a light wind sail that is taken from the top of the mizzen and down to the centre of the boat forward of the cockpit. Paired with a cruising chute or other light wind sails at the front of the boat, it provides extra speed and stability in light airs. Of course, having an extra sail doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a larger sail area. Sail plans are designed around the hull and its displacement. In fact, in most cases, a ketch will actually have smaller sails, but the overall sail plan will be made up for, of course, by that extra mizzen sail.
So who do you think ketches are particularly good for?
Very good question.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I mean, people like us,
Yeah.
couples, so short-handed sailing.
What about solo sailing? You've done a bit of that.
Solo sailing, much easier to manage the sails.
Is it that because they're smaller? That's the main reason?
Exactly, yeah, just easier to manage, which also means it's ideal for families as well.
Yeah.
And perhaps for older people as well, older
Yes,
couples.
like us. Yeah, it's generally an easy boat to handle, contrary to what people think who haven't actually sailed one. Probably the most famous of all ketches is Delos on their lovely Amel. So what are the advantages of a ketch rig? Well, we have just said the sails are smaller, so a lot easier to handle generally. They're not so heavy.
Especially in heavier weather. I think that's the key thing with
Yeah.
ketches, is their ease of handling in heavier weather.
Pete and Jen have been sailing their 49-foot ketch, Steel Sapphire, from Australia, and they're now in the Indian Ocean.
As a cruising couple, we're often sailing just one up. So we need to be able to manage all the sails individually ourselves. Being a 50-foot boat and a ketch actually does make that a lot easier because no one sail is too big.
Sometimes that can come in really handy. We were sailing from Langkawi to Koh Lipe last year, and the wind went from 10 knots to 35 to 40 knots in minutes. And we had all our sails up because the wind was so light. And we ended up putting everything away apart from just the mainsail. I would like to have reefed the main, but that would have meant coming up into the wind, and we didn't really fancy doing that. And it was so much easier. We just put everything else away because the mainsail itself is smaller than it would be in an average 50-foot boat. That was just the right amount of sail for that amount of wind. So yeah, that flexibility in sail plan is everything.
A lot of solo sailors say they prefer a sloop over a ketch because there are fewer sails to handle. But I would actually argue the opposite is true. Because those sails are smaller, they are much more easy to manage when you're sailing the boat on your own. And I would say I've sailed a fair few hundred miles of Esper on our own in some pretty heavy weather as well. With up to 4 sails on a ketch versus only 2 or 3 on a sloop, you have multiple options for handling different sailing conditions. You may have seen us opting to use just the Yankee and the Mizzen in unpredictable weather. This is called jib and jigger, and the Mizzen and Yankee balance each other perfectly. And people sometimes ask us, why don't you put the main out? And the fact is, we're still getting a comfortable 5 or 6 knots just jib and jiggering. And of course, the boat is more upright, it's more manageable, and your galley crew will thank you.
Many cruisers will either reef down or take the main down completely when they're sailing short-handed at night, just to manage risk and squalls, things like that, which works, but the downside is the boat's less balanced. So one advantage of a ketch is, and we often find ourselves sailing jib and jigger, so that's mizzen and headsail, and that makes the boat much more balanced and much easier for one person to handle.
Yeah, it's definitely my favourite way to sail, jib and jigger. It means that everything's led back to the cockpit, it's really easy to tweak, and when I'm up by myself, I can easily furl the sails without having to wake up Pete. Love jib and jigger.
Me too.
It's not unusual to be able to quickly balance the boat and set the sails to allow the boat to sail itself without autopilot. Once set, it's easy to trim the mizzen from the cockpit. In fact, the mizzen is a great way to quickly steer the boat and offers an advantage should you lose steering. The additional mizzen helps distribute the power throughout the boat rather than it being in the middle and forward of the mast.
Because the mizzen offers more control of the stern of the boat, it is more balanced, and especially in heavier weather, this equates to more comfort.
Something that always makes us smile is getting the mizzen out. It is just pure pleasure to deploy.
Yeah, and if that's what you get pure pleasure from, I'm doing something pretty wrong. But I do kind of know what you mean. It's just so easy to put it in and out with literally one hand, and because of that, it's the first sail that we put out every time and the last sail that we put away.
It's just so easy.
Like her.
With smaller sails, reefing down is a lot easier and can be done in any order depending on the wind without putting too much stress on the sail and without too much speed reduction. On our fin-keeled ketch, it is the main that is the most overpowered when the wind picks up, so that's normally the first to reef down. The mizzen is almost always the last sail to reef. It's often the first sail we get out and the last that we'll put away. You'll have seen us running downwind with the mizzen prevented out too. Basic physics will tell you that the larger the mast and the rigging, the more stress you're introducing. So by having those shorter masts and shorter sails, you are actually reducing the stress, and in theory that translates as reducing the wear on the rigging itself.
Heaving to with the mizzen and the staysail is both easy to manage and provides great stability.
Yep, you also get a spare sail as well. Think about it, if you lose your main, you've still got the mizzen as backup.
Ketches are almost always centre cockpit, providing a smoother ride as well as added safety.
Now we frequently keep the mizzen up when we're anchoring. Esper has a strong prop walk going into a stern, and the mizzen helps keep the boat straight when laying the chain. The same principle may be used when at anchor in a gusty spot. Leaving the mizzen out as a riding sail can help keep the boat into wind. Now we don't do this too often because of course that's introducing more wear and tear on the mizzen sail, but it's useful to have that there should you need it.
Yeah, and the other useful thing with the mizzen is that you can use the boom as a crane. We used to use ours to bring the dinghy up, didn't we?
That's right, yeah. When we had a smaller dinghy and we could stow it on the back of the boat, we used to hoist it over the solar panels and drop it down.
And for someone who's small and not very strong, you can use it as a crane to bring someone out of the water should they fall in.
So, with easier to manage sails, more versatility in sail plans, better performance and comfort in heavy weather, there is a reason why the ketch rig is still a popular sail plan. Some say it is the ultimate long-distance cruising type of boat. Now, it's unusual to see a ketch on anything smaller than 40 foot these days, but many of the super yachts are still built with a ketch rig design for all of these reasons.
Disadvantages, and yes, believe it or not, there are some disadvantages with a ketch. Just like in everything in life, you have to compromise.
Yeah, the first one that a lot of people mention is its performance to windward.
Yes.
Now, on paper, a ketch doesn't perform as well as a sloop to windward. Now, I say on paper because I've sailed alongside other boats and we've had absolutely no problems. I think it's partly to do with the fact we have the staysail.
We've got the cutter, that makes a difference.
Yeah. And of course, it's all to do with hull design as well. Esper is a very well designed boat. So I think really the performance to windward is something that would mainly concern racers, not cruisers. So with that extra mast and all that extra rigging, it's going to be heavier. But there is one thing to remember, of course, with those shorter sails, it does mean you're going to be reefing later. So you can really ramp up the ketch rig in heavy weather.
An obvious disadvantage to having a ketch is that you've got two masts, therefore an awful lot of standing rigging and running rigging and everything else that goes with it. And that's going to cost a lot to replace and even maintain.
Yeah. Although some people do argue that because you've got all these different sails to choose from, you might not necessarily have them all out at the same time. So perhaps your sails will last a little bit longer.
Is the jury out on that argument?
If you have a triatic like Esper does, this is the cable between the main mast and the mizzen mast. If the main mast goes down, it's going to take the mizzen mast with it. It's also not very good for flying drones into. One of the practical disadvantages of having that mizzen mast is, of course, it takes up valuable space on the aft deck. But we do know people have actually removed their mizzen mast. I can't say I would recommend this, since your rigging has been designed by someone that should know what they're doing and has designed it for balance and performance. And by removing that mizzen, you potentially upset that balance and performance. And of course, you lose out on all the other advantages that we've just mentioned.
It's actually quite rare to find a ketch, a brand new ketch, under 50 foot these days. So that means that if you want a ketch under 50 foot, you're looking for an older boat. And they are a little bit more difficult to find.
On paper, a mizzen can potentially disturb a wind vane mounted on the back of the boat. Now I say on paper because we have a wind pilot and we've used it extensively in the past and we've not really found it a problem.
The mizzen sail and even the mizzen boom can cause shadows on the solar panels on the back of the boat, which reduces their efficiency.
But the disadvantages are minimal for the average offshore cruiser. For us, comfort and performance, especially in heavier weather, are more important than that extra 0.3 knots when going up to wind. But that doesn't stop us from constantly sail trimming to get the most out of Esper's performance. 4 sails over 2 offer a great advantage in terms of sail plan.
By the way, that straw poll I mentioned at the beginning was done on a Facebook group called YouTube Sailing Channels. About 370 people responded. 42% of respondents said catamarans, 32% said sloop, 22% said ketch, and 4% said other.
But of course, this is barely scientific. That particular group, I suspect, of the 15,000 members, few actually own a boat. They're more about supporters of sailing channels.
Yeah.
But what it does show, of course, is that there is definitely a bias towards catamarans, and ketches came much further down on the list. But I think that's more of a reflection of the kind of YouTube channels they like watching. I imagine if you asked the same poll among sailors who own boats, I suspect a ketch would be much further up.
Yeah, and particularly blue water cruisers.
Exactly, that was the question. It was about blue water cruisers. And I think that's where ketch comes into its own.
Yeah.
That performance, the balance of power and the comfort in heavy offshore weather is where it comes into its own.
Sailing in heavy weather with a ketch is really awesome because you have so much flexibility with your sail plan. We once did an overnight 80 nautical mile sail from Lady Musgrave to Great Keppel, and we needed to get in the morning in daylight, so we needed to actually slow down, and it was perfect. You know, we were in 25 knots of wind, 2 to 3 meters of seas, and we sailed just the Mizzen alone. It was awesome. We were doing 5 or 6 knots and easy as.
It's a bit of a dry subject for some people, but we wanted to get those facts across, and it is a question that we're asked all the time, isn't it?
It is, and I thought it was about time we bloody answered
Yeah, I
it
know, I
in
agree.
full.
Yeah.
So lots of things to discuss there. We'd love to know what you think. I think we'd love to hear from blue water cruisers as well, people
Yeah.
that do offshore sailing and their own experiences in ketches, catamarans, light wind boats and heavy off-water, blue water cruisers as well.
It was a really great question, and we're getting them all the time, so if you've got a question on any subject, put it in the comments below and we'll add it to the list, and hopefully we'll be answering yours on camera. In the meantime, peace and fair winds.